Hey guys, it's Hannah, and today I'm coming to you with one of my favorite videos to film every year, and that is my favorite books of 2016. So 2016 was a pretty fantastic reading year for me. I read a total of 70 books, which was my Goodreads reading goal, and I met that goal, so I'm really pleased with that. I also felt that this year I really expanded my reading in terms of reading a more wide variety of genres. I usually tend to stick to mostly fantasy and magical realism and historical fiction, but this year I feel like I really branched out. I read some poetry, I read some plays, some mystery, thriller, some fantasy and historical fiction mixed in there as well, but I just felt like overall this year I really expanded my reading tastes, and I'm really happy with that. So even though I read so many great books this year, there were a total of 10 books that really stood out to me as my favorites and definitely made it on my list of favorites of all time. These are really in no particular order except for maybe the top 3 or the top 5. So without any further ado, let's get into my favorite books of the year. My first favorite that I have here is You by Caroline Kepnes. I read this book back in October, I believe, around Halloween, and I think it was the perfect time to read this book. You is told in the first person narrative from the perspective of this man who is stalking this woman because he's obsessed and fascinated with her. And honestly, that's all you really need to know about it, because this is one of the most mind-boggling books that I have ever read. It will mess with your head like nothing else. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for everyone because it deals with a lot of very adult themes like violence and sex and abuse and just a lot of things that if you're not comfortable with, I wouldn't really recommend for you. But if you're comfortable reading any of that, I would highly recommend picking this book up, especially around the spookier months, because it is something that will definitely stick with you and leave you thinking about it constantly. I have not stopped thinking about this book since I read it. It's just always in the back of my mind because it is written so well, and it really feels like the narrator is actually in your head a lot of the time, and then other times it feels like he's almost directly talking to you, and it makes for such an interesting reading experience, and it's unlike anything I've ever experienced before, and that is definitely why it's on my list of favorites. This is absolutely one of the most unique books I've ever had the pleasure of reading, and I highly commend it for that. The next spot on my list goes to All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This is a historical fiction World War II novel that takes place over a span of years, but it mostly just follows the invasion of France by Germany, and we follow the perspective of 2 different characters. One of them is a young boy turned Nazi soldier, and the other character is a young French girl who is blind. It tells each of their individual stories, and then we also get to see where their stories converge, and it is truly one of the most beautiful books I have ever read. First of all, the writing is absolutely exquisite. It is so captivating, and it will just keep you reading and reading. And second of all, the narrative structure itself is just fabulous. It's told from different perspectives, like I said, but we also get some other perspectives thrown in here as well, and we also have an overarching story of kind of like this story that the girl hears at the beginning of the book, and we get to see how that little story that she hears at the beginning of the book connects with the themes of the overall story of this book, and it's just so beautiful. If you like historical fiction, I'm sure you will also enjoy this one, but it is just a very fresh perspective, I think, on the historical fiction genre. It's very different than a lot of the other historical fiction that I've read, and that's another reason that I really enjoyed it. And again, this is just another story that has stuck with me ever since I read it, and I think about it all the time. And it's the type of book that when I finished it, I immediately wanted to pick it up and give it a reread. My next favorite of 2016 has to go to Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. This book came out in 2015, I believe, and I'd heard everyone talking about it because it's based off of the book Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. In that book, Kath, the main character, writes fan fiction about these 2 characters named Simon and Baz, and then Rainbow Rowell decided to write her own version of their story, so that's what Carry On ended up being. And essentially what this story is about is it's kind of like a meta version of Harry Potter. It's essentially based off of Harry Potter because we follow a chosen one hero type of character named Simon Snow who goes to this magical school, and he has to defeat the insidious humdrum, which is like this dark magical thing that is causing a lot of havoc. And in the midst of all that, he is roommates with his arch nemesis Baz, and it's about the 2 of them and their relationship, and it is just such a fantastic book. It's also an LGBTQ+ story and romance, and I adore it with every fiber of my being. This book is absolutely hilarious, and I'm not the type of person who usually picks up funny books. I'm very much a sad book person, but with this one, I just couldn't put it down and I couldn't stop laughing. It made me cry, it made me laugh, it made me want to throw it across the room in the best way possible. I just felt so many emotions while reading this book, and anytime a book can do that to me, I know it's a sign that I love it. So I'm so happy that I finally picked this book up this year, because I know that if I'm ever feeling sad, I can always reach for it and reread some certain chapters and it will automatically make me happy because it is just such a lovely and happy story. The next book I have here is actually a collection of poetry, and that is Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. So like I said, this is a collection of poetry and it's divided into 4 parts: the hurting, the loving, the breaking, and the healing. And as the name for each part indicates, each section deals with a different topic, but the overarching themes throughout the entire collection are about self-love and body image, and it has a lot of feminist themes in here, and just so many wonderful, wonderful things that reading through this was honestly one of the most emotional experiences I've ever had. There were so many poems in here, as you can see, because I've marked so many of them, that I connected with so much, and they meant so much to me. And it was just incredible how much Rupi Kaur was able to convey in just a few lines of poetry. The poems are very short, as you can see. It's definitely contemporary poetry, but each line is just so meaningful and so powerful and hard-hitting, and it meant the world to me reading this. And it was actually this collection that got me to start writing my own poetry again, because I used to write it a lot, but then I stopped, and ever since reading this, I've been writing fairly consistently, and I'm also just so blown away by it. And there are still times where I will pick this up and reread a few of my favorites because they just make me so happy and remind me how much words really do mean. The next book, or books I should say, on my list are all part of the same trilogy, and that is the Daughter of Smoke and Bone Trilogy by Laini Taylor. So this is just the first book, but I have the other 2 books sitting on my shelf right there, and the whole series is on my list of favorites because while the 3rd one was technically my favorite book, the entire series has to be on this list because altogether they are true perfection. This series is actually very difficult to describe because it's kind of complicated, and I feel like saying too much kind of spoils the entire point of the series. But in essence, it follows the story of this girl named Karu who lives in Prague, and she is kind of an odd character. She has blue hair and she's covered with a lot of tattoos. She goes to art school, but she also lives kind of a double life because she's part of this whole other world of chimera and angels. She herself is human, but she works for these chimera who are essentially like creatures who are mixed with different creatures, so you can be part human, part lion, part alligator, essentially just like a mixture of different animals. And then in this world there are also angels, and the chimera and angels are at war with one another. And that's really all I like to say for the synopsis because it just kind of gives you an idea of the world, and anything else will just spoil what happens. But from the moment I read this series, it automatically became one of my favorite series of all time. The writing in here is just exquisite. It creates the most vivid fantasy world that you could ever think of. The characters are so lifelike and they have so much dimension to them. Each of them is completely flawed but extremely lovable. You have so much going on with wars between chimera and angels, and all of this magic and fantasy and romance and politics and relationships and just so many things that you would think it would be overwhelming, but it just blends together so perfectly. These books just perfectly encompass everything I love in fantasy, and that's why they're on my list of favorites. The next books on my list are also part of a fantasy trilogy, and that is the Mistborn Trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. I've only read the first 2 books. I still have the 3rd book to complete, but still, these books are definitely on my list of favorites. These books take place in a world where this villain, the Lord Ruler, has kind of taken over the world and all of the land, and essentially he is oppressing these people called the Ska, who are now essentially like slaves. And he himself and the nobility get to live like nobility while these other people are oppressed. And there's a magic system in the book as well that is based off of metals. So people who have magical abilities can consume metals and then use those metals as different forms of power. So most people who have magical powers can just consume one metal and use that one metal, whereas there are very few people called Mistborns who are extremely powerful and can consume multiple types of metals and use them in multiple different ways. Again, similar to Daughter of Smoke and Bone, they're full of action and political intrigue and romance and everything you could want in a fantastic fantasy novel. The characters are so well developed and again, extremely flawed, but they're so realistic because of that. And the politics of this world and the world that Brandon Sanderson has created is just incredible. The world building in these books is unlike anything I've ever read before, and it's just so mesmerizing to get completely lost in this world because this is the perfect book if you're looking to just escape reality. You can get completely lost in this. The next book on my list is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This follows the story of these 2 college students named Victor and Eli, and they are roommates and kind of just best friends. and they are both working on their thesis, and Eli decides to write his thesis on the existence of EOs, or extraordinary people, essentially people with superhuman abilities. And this thesis ends up leading the two of them to start experimenting on how to create EOs, which leads to a whole slew of other things that I don't want to get into because I don't want to get into spoilers. But when it comes down to it, this book is really about the line between good and evil and how we really draw that line and what it all really means. This, I definitely would say, is a character-driven story, which is my favorite thing about it because I love, love, love characters, and the characters in here are absolutely wonderful. I don't really know how to describe this, but something about this book made me feel really nostalgic, and I think that's because of the characters and how well developed they are and how much I felt like I actually knew them. And I think that more than anything was the part of this story that really captivated me and made me fall so in love with it. So if you're looking for a book with a fantastic plot as well as some wonderful, lovable, and flawed characters, this is definitely the one I'd recommend. The next books on my list are all part of the same series, and that is The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater. I'm specifically holding up The Raven King because out of the four, this one was my favorite one, but the entire series is making it on my list because I adore this series. But it follows the story of these four Southern prep school boys and this girl named Blue as they all go on these adventures searching for a dead Welsh king. It's very paranormally, there are ghosts and ley lines and things, but it is also one of the most fantastic book series I have ever read in my entire life, and it is one of my all-time favorites. The writing in here is so vivid and dreamlike because a lot of the story is based around dreams, and the writing complements that perfectly. And similarly to Vicious, it's really the characters that made me fall so in love with this series. I felt so connected to all of them because I felt like they were my actual friends, and it was really easy for me to see some of my own friends in some of these characters, so reading from that perspective made me just love them even more because I could relate so much to them. Mostly the story just revolves around the friendships between all of these characters, and there are romantic relationships in here as well. There are LGBTQ+ relationships in the series as well, and some diverse characters, so that also makes me very happy. But it's the characters and their friendships that have made me fall so deeply in love with these books and made them some of my all-time favorites. So coming in at number 2 of my favorite books I read in 2016 is The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicole Yoon. This book follows these two characters named Natasha and Daniel, and Natasha is a Jamaican immigrant whose family is about to be deported to Jamaica, and Daniel is a Korean-American boy who is just now applying to college and trying to live up to his parents' expectations. The story takes place over the span of one day, and it follows their relationship with each other, but the themes of the book are about so much more. It deals with immigration, it deals with race, it deals with relationships and family, and so many wonderful and important things that are so rare to find in a lot of YA books, and that's what makes this so special to me. I also personally really related to Natasha's character in this book, and I've talked about this before as well, but finding a character that I can relate to in terms of identity is very difficult for me for the most part, and while I don't relate to her in every aspect, there was so much of her character that I could see myself in, and that just made for an incredible reading experience. The narrative structure of this book is also incredible. It's told from both Natasha and Daniel's perspectives, but then we get some perspectives of other characters mixed in there as well as little sections that give little descriptions about things like science or physics, and sometimes about love or English or poetry, and it is just so incredibly unique because of that, and each of those little things ties into the overall theme of the story as well, and it makes it such a wonderful read. I've mentioned this many times before, but I'm not the biggest fan of YA contemporary. However, this book has definitely set a new standard for me because if I can find more YA contemporary like this one, I will definitely fall in love with the genre. And finally, moving on to my number one favorite book of 2016. This should be no surprise to anyone who's been watching my channel for the past couple of months at least, but that is Kirkuk Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. So really, I'm including both Kirkuk Kingdom and Six of Crows in this list because the duology together is what kind of makes it my favorite, but this book specifically is my favorite one because it just blew me completely and utterly away, and I have not been the same since reading this book. So if you don't know, the Six of Crows duology takes place in the Grishaverse, which is part of Leigh Bardugo's other series, the Shadow and Bone Trilogy, and it takes place after the events of those books, and we follow around these 6 characters who are all kind of criminals, and they're commissioned to go on this heist. The heist encompasses most of the first book, and then the aftermath of the heist is what Kirkuk Kingdom itself deals with, and it's just Honestly, one of the greatest books I have ever read, and I think it's my second favorite book I've ever read. I also have a full spoilery review for this book up on my channel already, so if you've read this book and you want to hear all of my in-depth spoilery thoughts, I'll leave that linked on the screen as well as down below so you can go check it out. But this is just such a wonderfully diverse book, and I mean that in every sense of the word. You have a fantastic cast of characters who are diverse in terms of ability, race, sexuality, and so many things, and that is just so meaningful. This book also deals with really important topics like human trafficking and political corruption and poverty and just so much that is just so incredible to find in a YA fantasy book, and that is just something that completely blew me away about it. And again, like I've mentioned many times, I am such a sucker for character-driven books, and this is absolutely a character-driven book. Each character is completely unique and has their own distinctive personality, and each one is flawed and complex, but I love them all so much. I adore morally gray characters, and each of them are definitely morally gray, especially because they are criminals. But to see all of that in a YA fantasy novel is just something that is so rare and something that I wish was in more YA fantasy, and this just completely and utterly blew me away, like I said. So if you have not given the Six of Crows duology a read yet, I highly recommend these books with every fiber of my being. They are just so fantastic, and if you like fantasy, I promise you these will not disappoint. Alright guys, so that is it for my favorite books of 2016. So let me know in the comments down below what were your top 3 favorite books that you read in 2016. If you would like to follow me on any of my social media, all of my links are in the description box as always. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have a wonderful new year, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!